have a love-hate relationship with curling irons. On the one hand, I've used them since I was 11 years old, and I do like the way they style my hair. On the other hand, though, of course they can be dangerous. I've burned myself with one. And they also symbolize my participation in American beauty culture, a culture that is often frustrating and sometimes demeaning. I wrote an essay called The Hot Thing about my ambivalence over using a curling iron. It's part of an anthology I co-edited called From Curlers to Chainsaws, a collection of essays about women and their relationships to all kinds of machines, from domestic ones such as an electric stove and a Singer sewing machine, to more surprising contraptions, including a handgun and a chainsaw. As I was working on my own essay, I wound up reading quite a lot about the history of curling irons, or what the Victorians called hair tongs, with the intention of drawing on this research to make a commentary on the demands of beauty culture and how these demands impact young girls growing up in America. But it turned out that the essay didn't quite develop as I'd planned. Drafting an essay, any essay, is rarely straightforward. Aristotle called this process inventio, or invention. And the invention process isn't at all like a set of railroad tracks inviting a traveler to cross mountains and skim fields along a clear path with the sky open all the way to the horizon. No, any essayist working on a first draft simply can't see that far or move that fast. Instead, invention is more like walking through a jungle, seeing only a thick tangle of leaves a few feet ahead. You get out your machete and you hack at the underbrush. You clear a trail as you go. Sometimes you get stuck and have to backtrack, and sometimes you're surprised, stumbling on a snake or glimpsing a crescent moon through the trees. The purpose of invention, of that first attempt to get your thoughts down on paper and give them a shape, is to explore and to discover what your essay wants to be about. And I do mean what the essay wants, not just you. Let me quote Patricia Hampl on this point. She says that the difference between what the writer wants and what the essay wants has to do with the relation that writers have to their own unconscious or half-known intentions and impulses in composition. Hampl believes that the relationship between a writer and a first draft is a bit like a couple of acquaintances who are wary of one another, but who find greater comfort and understanding down the road. Intimacy with a piece of writing, as with a person, comes from paying close attention to the revelations it is capable of giving, not by imposing one's own notions and agenda. Now, I have to admit that when I started writing my piece on the curling iron, I was thinking only about my own relationship to this machine. I didn't consider the consequences for anyone else related to what I might have to say about this subject. Instead, I worked to build an ethos or a sense of credibility through my narrative voice through detailed research and my own private memories. I didn't think through any ethical ramifications of what my essay might mean to others. And as it turned out, my essay wound up being more confessional than I'd first imagined it would be. The essay wanted to be about my own coming of age as much as the history of hair tongs or a comment on American beauty culture. So I confided that I was the first girl in my class to develop, as my grandmother used to say, and I spent a good bit of time talking about my preteen years when all I could think about was what it might be like to kiss a boy. This last point actually culminated in a painfully revealing memory from when I was 11 years old, when I practiced kissing on a life-size poster I had in my bedroom of John Schneider. Now, if you don't remember who John Schneider is, he's a cheesy country singer, best known for playing Bo Duke in the early 1980s TV show, The Dukes of Hazzard. Even now that my essay is done and published, I still cringe when I reread this part of it. I pity the poor girl who knows so little and yet desires so much. It also turned out that my essay wanted to be about mothers and daughters. Here's an excerpt from The Hot Thing, in which I talk about my frustrations over my own mother's refusal to play the beauty game. I was greenly jealous of my peers' moms with their bleach blonde hair, tanning bed arms, toothpick waists, and closets full of brand new clothes, blouses and skirts and pants and designer jeans that some of the mothers let their daughters borrow. I didn't know whether my mom's lack of interest in all things fashionable came from being an immigrant from Scotland or because she was a reader, a writer, and a teacher. So mind over matter. All I knew was that while she would buy me any book I asked for or take me to any play I might want to see, she couldn't explain how to contour eyeshadow or tell me whether my sweater complemented my complexion. She didn't diet, she didn't read women's magazines, and she refused to buy me the enormous gold earrings or spiky red shoes I coveted, stilettos sharp enough to skewer fish. And even though this disinterest meant I didn't have to participate in a daily beauty competition with a trophy mom, I also didn't have a beauty mentor that I could trust. So I was left to try and copy the popular girls at school, TV and movie icons, or the breathtaking stars in magazines. Even the curling iron was a purchase I had to negotiate on my own. I asked Mom to take me to a drugstore, stuffing a magazine ad in my purse for a crazy curl curling iron. The ad assured me that the steam styling wand would create quick little flips and crazy little curls. It vowed that the iron had the power to make me beautiful, that I'd love my new device like crazy. At the store, I quickly parted from Mom and strode to the hair care aisle. And there it was on the shelf in all of its lime green glory, a crazy curl curling iron with a photograph of a blonde model with a Farrah Fawcett flip. Behind this beautiful machine, the box promised, is a great-looking you. Before I sent the final version of this essay to my editor, I asked my mom to read it. I felt that she might disagree with my version of events, and I also didn't want to catch her off guard when the essay was published. I shouldn't have worried. My mother was gracious and supportive, as she's been for the whole of my writing life. In an email to me, she wrote, "It's a phenomenal piece of writing, especially the depth of research you've translated into a personal text. Well done, Jennifer." And since Mom didn't ask me to change a thing, I gave the piece one more read-through and I sent it off. On to the next project, I thought. A few weeks later, however, I met my sister for a weekend in Washington, D.C. I live only a couple of hours from the city, and my sister was attending a conference, so she extended her stay by a couple of days so that we could spend a little time together. After my sister and I had enjoyed a really delectable dinner at a cozy little restaurant, we went back to our hotel to drink a little wine and to talk. But even before we uncorked the bottle, my sister said, "Jen, I have to talk with you about something." My mother had shared my curling iron essay with my sister, and she was unhappy that parts of it were about my adolescent sense that Mom maybe wasn't always the best of parents. "I don't think what you wrote is very nice," she said. "Don't you think you might have hurt Mom's feelings?" I was stunned, and at first I was a bit defensive. I'd shown the essay to Mom, after all, and she'd liked it, and the piece was much more embarrassing to me than it was to anyone else. But after my sister and I had talked some more, I had to admit that I hadn't thought fully about the consequences of what I'd written for anyone beyond myself. Patricia Hampl talks about a similar situation in her own essay called Other People's Secrets, although the struggles she explores between her desire to write honest essays and her relationship with her mother are more fierce and far-reaching. When Hampl was in her early 30s, she sold her first book of poems, and her mother wrote on the calendar, "First book accepted." But Hampl then reveals that the first poem in the book ends by telling the world that her mother had epilepsy, which was a family secret. There it was, she explains, the grand mal seizure as the finishing touch, a personal fact that morphed into a symbol, opening the poem I knew wide, wide, wide. At first, her mother was horrified that Hampl had exposed this secret. She worried that she might get fired or that people might look at her differently. Yet when Hampl said she'd be willing to cut the poem from the book, if that's what her mom wanted, her mother relented, and the poem stayed in. Years later, Hampel decided to ask her mom if giving permission to publish the poem was a kind of relief, or whether her mother had agreed only because she loved her. Without hesitation, her mom said, "Because I loved you," and then added, "I always hated it." Hampel says that publishing this poem signals the beginning of what she now calls her career of betrayal, meaning that in writing personal essays and memoirs, she tells other people's secrets now and then, or interprets their personalities in ways that they find hurtful, incomplete, or sometimes just plain wrong. As Hampel puts it, "I've lost quite a few people along the way, and not to death. I lose them to writing." With this essay, Hampel is trying to have an open conversation about an ethical dilemma that most essayists have to consider at some point, just how responsible a writer has to be about other people's privacy. Yet Hampel is also talking about the transition between a process of pure invention and the complete first draft of an essay, a draft that's ready to be extended or cut, shaped, and honed. "I try to let pretty much anything happen in a first draft," Hampel says. "A careful first draft is a failed first draft." When she gets to the point of starting to shape a draft into something more clearly defined, an essay that's less about the self and more about the world, Hampel says that her next draft must be a new seeing of the materials of the first draft. Nothing cosmetic will do. For when she arrives at her second draft, Hampel must consider her readers. She has to think about what will move them or convince them, and also what might anger or irritate or bore them. Let me quote Aristotle for a minute. He says that invention is the power of discovering, in the particular case, what are the available means of persuasion. Although the primary mode of communication in ancient Greece was oral and not written, Aristotle saw all discourse as persuasive discourse. For Aristotle, whether we communicate verbally or through writing, or even by using our body language, we are attempting to persuade someone else to listen to us and to believe us. Even more important is Aristotle's conviction that a speaker or a writer discovers her available means of persuasion. Why? Because discovery suggests that a writer is consciously aware of how and why she wants to communicate. And any piece of communication is thus a carefully considered process involving the writer, her intended audience, and her subject matter. The writer has something important to say, because to her it must be said. What she has to say is her truth, and so she must discover or choose the best available means by which to convey that truth. And it's this process of discovery and careful selection that takes the writer through a process of invention. In the case of Hampel's story about revealing her mother's epilepsy, she makes careful rhetorical choices to arrive at her main point, which is actually not to confess that she wronged her mother. Instead, her essay's central purpose is to consider that age-old tension for writers between silence and speech. For Hampel struggles with the complexity of human intimacy that can never be captured fully through language. As she herself puts it, "The truth is the constraining suit of words rarely fits. Writers and readers believe in the fiction of telling a true story, but the living subject knows it is the work of a culprit." Another well-known essayist, Dinty Moore, writes about a similar topic in a piece called "The Deeper End of the Quarry." Yet Moore ultimately comes to a very different conclusion about whether it's better to choose speech over silence. Where Hampel makes the case that interpreting the past through writing is the best means we have of creating a collective sense of history and of witnessing, Moore explains in his essay why sometimes a writer should just keep quiet. Moore tells us that he couldn't finish a book about the difficulties of raising a daughter in America, even after spending 5 years on research and writing, and having a total of 1,200 drafted pages on the topic. And while Moore agrees that the duty of the writer is to view the world with no filters over the eyes, no glossing over the truth for the sake of politeness or propriety, he felt that when it came to writing about how he and his preteen daughter grappled with sexism, with the objectification of girls in American popular culture, he just couldn't be honest, at least not on the page. For honesty would mean that he would have to judge and find fault in his own child. And to Moore, he says it is the duty of parents to look at their children and not see the possible faults. So it's interesting to think about how these two essay writers land on both sides of the speech-silence coin. Their opposite decisions to reveal or to conceal their family's dirty laundry illuminate how writers take up distinct modes of invention and also create different approaches to achieving ethos or credibility in their essays. So let me give you a short example of what I mean. Towards the end of Hampel's essay, as she's bringing together her main ideas, she writes, "My mother's passage through this life, the shape she too has made of things, her visions, the things she alone knows. I can see now that she was standing up for the truth of her experience, the literal fact of it, how it jerked and twisted not only her body but her life, how it truly seized her. My poem and I, we merely fingered the thing, casually displaying it for the idle passerby. What she knows and how she knows it must not be taken from her." So here, Hampel's word choice is literary or formal, with words such as passage, visions, literal, fingered, and passerby. And she also uses metaphor and sense-based imagery. She plays on that double meaning of the word seized, and she uses the precision of the verbs jerked and twisted to recreate the sensation for the reader of what a seizure might feel like. Now, since the main point of her essay is complex, it makes sense then that her language level and imagery are also complex. And yet, Hampel also wishes to speak to a wide audience, to touch universal human experience. And so she also uses more informal diction with words such as things, knows, and life. That final sentence, what she knows and how she knows it must not be taken from her, is entirely made up of monosyllabic words, except for one, which means it's an accessible sentence and also an emphatic one. It's as if maybe Hampel got out a big bass drum and is striking it 15 times in a row. What she knows and how she knows it must not be taken from her. And the fact that taken is the only word with 2 syllables speaks, at least I think, to how this essay insists that no writer can ever really take or seize the memories of others, since language is but a partial substitute for the intricacy of the human mind. Now, for the sake of comparison, let's look at a passage from Moore's essay. Did my daughter sense my concern, my misgivings, my doubts about her and about myself during her teenage years? Sure she did. But that's different from putting it all down on the page, discussing it without filter or censor, and making it public. Other writers have negotiated this path, for good or for ill, but I could not. And all the clever sidestepping in the world didn't mask this from the reader. When something, a book or a story, doesn't ring true, it doesn't ring true. That's part of the challenge of art, and part of the beauty as well. So here, while Dinty Moore also has a little bit of elevated diction, most people don't say misgivings or negotiated on a daily basis, he mostly uses everyday words and phrases. Moore talks about how his daughter senses his concern and doubts. He calls writing putting it all down on the page, and he uses a well-known expression, for good or for ill, and then repeats the phrase, it doesn't ring true. And while Moore's lifelong training as a writer is clear in his very careful sentence structure, for the most part, his word choice is conversational. He's just a guy talking to the reader. And since Moore's essay is about how he struggled and then failed to write a book about raising a girl in America, this conversational word choice is true to his essay's purpose. Okay. So in addition to making different choices about whether to use more literary or more everyday language, Hampel and Moore also write their essays in very different forms, although both of them begin with anecdotes about their mothers. Hampel starts with that story about publishing the epilepsy poem, and Moore tells a tale of how he wrote a thinly veiled short story about his mom's alcoholism. Much to Dinty Moore's chagrin, his sister wound up sharing this story with their mother, and yet his mom quickly dismissed it after reading it. His mom said, "Oh, that Dinty, how does he make this stuff up?" The only commonality in structure between these two essays, then, are these openings about mothers. After that, Hampel's essay brings in a story about Franz Kafka, set against the backdrop of World War I. She muses about how difficult it is to be accurate with history during wartime. Hampel's aim is to cast her essay's light wide, 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 to try and illuminate the very nature of memory and to ask who owns it. As a result, her essay is episodic, on the long side. In a sense, she seems to want to fill the voids of history, the silence of billions who've never had a chance to tell their own stories, with anecdotes, examples, allusions, and extended metaphors. She lays out an entire philosophy about what it means to write other people's stories and to sometimes share their secrets. On the other hand, Dinty Moore keeps the circle of his lamplight close. He talks only about his own writing and his own fiction and essays, and his piece is short, in keeping with the fact that he's interested in something else, namely in what language cannot and maybe shouldn't capture. Moore's essay isn't at all episodic. Instead, it contrasts a single anecdote about a short story against another about an unfinished book. In this way, then, Moore's essay is as much about the white space at the end of his page as it is about his words and sentences. In other words, Dinty Moore's form fits the function of his main point. Okay, so let me return to Aristotle's concept of invention. Once Hampel and Moore know what they want to write about and then make distinct choices about their essay's diction and form, other options are no longer available to them. Moore shouldn't write a long, meandering essay about silence. To do so would belie his purpose, and in turn, Hampel shouldn't craft a brief colloquial essay to consider the messiness of individual memory in the face of history. That tone and approach wouldn't serve her sweeping and yet nuanced points. And it's these self-imposed rhetorical limitations, these deliberate choices, that help explain and also determine how Hampel and Moore's respective essays develop in the ways they do, and why their voices just aren't at all the same. I want to add that their voices shouldn't be the same either, at least not if their desire is to further their ethos or credibility with their readers. In both cases, these writers are dishing up dirt on other people, namely their mothers. But an essay writer's ethos shouldn't be built on gossip. For different reasons and with distinct purposes in mind, both Hampel and Moore had to think about what it means to be ethical, as well as credible, when writing about other people. So as you follow your own process of invention, you'll need to realize that regardless of what you choose to write about, in seeking stories and writing them down, you're also becoming a kind of history keeper. Whatever you put into your essays will be but a version of the truth, not the whole and nothing but the truth, and you'll have to acknowledge your limitations. Even more, if you choose to reveal family dysfunction or the more irritating quirks of your closest friends, you'll need to ask yourself whether you're doing so for the right reasons. Your goal should be to witness the imperfect and messy, and also the beautiful and miraculous experience of the human. And as long as you keep that intention, you'll create a strong ethos, selecting the right words and putting those words into the right order to develop a workable structure. To start such an essay, let's begin by brainstorming. You might try to trace or map your own memories related to your subject matter. Or you might keep a notebook in which you jot down anything that you come across, quotations, data, metaphors that speak to your topic. Recording memories and keeping a little archive of your reading are both forms of what might be called maybe first-level invention, or again, what we also call brainstorming. But a more complete process, or a second-level invention, would be to step back and to take that wider view, to consider how your readers will be affected by what you write. So if a first-level invention is to hack through that underbrush of the jungle, a second level is to arrive at a welcome clearing, to see more than a few feet ahead, the grasses under your feet, the stars above, strewn like salt. To end this lecture, I'd like us to look at the conclusion of my own essay on the curling iron. Here, I tried to widen the mother-daughter dynamic I discussed earlier by turning to my relationship with my own daughter. As soon as my daughter Catherine could walk, I taught her to avoid my curling iron. Shiny and smooth, with a barrel that had a part to snap open and close like a mouth, I knew the iron would beckon with welcome. Glowing with its one red eye, it would say, "Come on, Kate, come on and play." So I called my curling iron the hot thing. I said, "Kate, don't go near the hot thing. It burns, it hurts." I repeated these warnings every day. Each morning for 14 years now, Kate has watched me coil my hair into serpents. My curls aren't those of an innocent pixie. No, I'm a witch. For 14 years, I have disguised my true fears in giving birth to a daughter rather than to a son. I've feared her disfiguring herself in the name of beauty, if not with a curling iron, then with starvation or plastic surgery. I've feared her having teenage sex, trying to learn to love herself by seeking someone else's love. And I've feared her getting raped. If I were to say I had curled my daughter's toes, it would mean metaphorically that I had shocked or frightened her. And this has been precisely my intent, to make Kate afraid. As a small girl, I taught her to fear the hot thing. As a teenager, I've taught her to fear the siren song of beauty. Hair hurts. That is a simple fact. My curling iron has stamped me with memory's brand. When I first sent this essay to my editor, I didn't yet have anything in there about Kate. It was only after that heart-to-heart I had with my sister and a follow-up talk with my own mom that I realized I had an obligation to qualify how I was representing my own mother by turning to myself as a parent. In order to achieve the strongest ethos that I could, I needed to rethink how my essay was developing, particularly its form. And so I added a pair of bookends to the piece, a beginning and this ending, in which I tried to complicate my thoughts about raising a daughter in that same girl-poisoning culture that Dinty Moore wrote of. So it turns out that my essay wanted, I would even say it needed, to be about my own anguished parenting, my own mistakes, my own fears. If my essay was going to invent the truth as accurately as possible, I needed to inhabit the roles of both daughter and mother. Because, as Patricia Hampl says, what is remembered is what becomes reality. Now, eventually, my essay will be but a sliver of what is remembered, of what is real about my mom, about my daughter, and about me, as well as, of course, about middle-class women living in America. For our personal memories rewrite whole histories, and we essay writers must ever be mindful that what we invent is not only our own story, but everyone's story.